Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Solar Energy for Climate Change Conference. I'm your moderator for today. My name is Bonnie Au, and it's my honor to be here. So just to give some background about the conference, this is actually the first time that such a conference was held by CarbonCare InnoLab. And I also want to let you know that this 3-day conference is also funded by the Jockey Club Charities Trust. For this session named Navigating Geopolitical Risks in the Energy Transition Strategies for Success, we will be exploring some of the geopolitical risks and also looking at how we might work around them to ensure success in the energy transition process. So joining us today, we have Mr. Corey Combs, Associate Director of Trivium China. And then we also have Dr. Roman Verkolchuk, Head of the Research Group for Climate and Energy and Senior Researcher at NUPI, which is in Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And then lastly, we also have Ms. Caroline Avon, Senior Natural Resources and Just Transition Researcher at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So in a few moments, Corey will be sharing with us an in-depth look at the geopolitical risks in the energy transaction process, and then followed by Dr. Verkolchuk. And lastly, we have Caroline. And after each of the turns to share their presentations, we'll have a moderated Q&A session before opening it up to the virtual floor for more questions. So before we go to our first speaker, let me give you a brief introduction of Corey. So at Trivium China, Corey directs their cross-cutting research on China's climate, natural resource and industrial policies. He also advises governments and multinationals on China's decarbonization strategy, along with opportunities for international engagement and collaboration. He's also a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and this is a committee that promotes bilateral understanding and cooperation. And previously, he also consulted on energy technology commercialization at the U.S. Department of Energy. So without further ado, let me pass it on to Corey Combs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my slides in just one moment. But I have to say, it's a pleasure to see a conference like this put together for a variety of reasons. So hello, everyone. So as mentioned, I work at Trivium China. This is a strategic advisory and policy research firm. And so long and short, we're looking day in, day out at a variety of geopolitical risks, policy risks, and really what we're looking at is policy to market feedback loops. Obviously, geopolitics is a central driver. In a 20-minute presentation, obviously, we're not going to get to every one of the major geopolitical specific issues that we track on a daily basis. So what I'd like to try to do today is provide a bit of a more holistic framework, how we're looking at geopolitical risk. And one important distinction I'll note is obviously, we're all reacting to responding in real time to evolving geopolitical risks today. My purpose is not to unpack all of that. My purpose is to look at the next 5 to 10 years. How does the current trajectory, what's driving it, what's shaping it, and how might it look in the next 5 to 10 years? Our thesis is quite simple. The first step to reacting appropriately to geopolitical risk is being well prepared ahead of time. And so that's where a clear framework comes in. Now, of course, there are a lot of ways you could look at geopolitical risk. What we're going to do in this little foray, I should say, is really focus on the solar side, but I'm going to have broader comments more generally applicable to green transition. So with that, multi-axis tracking, little pun of mine, really looking at 3 levels of geopolitical risk. Now, I'm going to adopt a few terms from industry here. Upstream, midstream, and downstream. Obviously, adapting these terms in a little bit of a different way. But what we really mean by this is looking at the different phases of influence. Upstream, the number one thing we're seeing, it's no surprise to anybody, strategic mineral competition. I really want to look at specifically how Chinese and US-led, but not US unique, broader Western geopolitical goals are really causing significant changes in the likely resource allocation, resource extraction picture over the next decade. Midstream, what is the biggest issue midstream when we look at green tech markets? It is really about technological competition. And that's 2 parts. That's one is the intellectual property, I think there'll be no surprise to anyone who's following, for example, sanctions on Xinjiang from the West, looking at Chinese companies routing capacity through Southeast Asia. I'm sure we'll hear more about this later. But the other side is also competition over the equipment used to produce solar equipment and other green tech equipment. This is perhaps most obvious, and the best analog right now is probably in the semiconductor space, which is a little adjacent, but highly relevant, of course, to a variety of green technologies. But looking at, for example, lithography machines produced by ASML, what's the sanctions go on there? Looking at the picture of who can actually produce high-end semiconductors. So part of this is not just IP of the actual technology, but also what's used to create many of the key products. Lastly, the piece that I think often gets a little bit missed out of certain discussions I'm part of is downstream demand drivers. At the end of the day, many of the countries driving certain geopolitical risks, they're driven by domestic interests, ultimately, right? And so we have to be very attentive to where does the demand lie. If a particular country is less interested or less pushing for a certain technology or certain good, chances are the risk will be lower, and where demand starts to rise, we'll see increased risk. So we're going to look a little bit at how that might play out over the next few years. So for each of these, we're going to have 2 slides. We'll keep it short, we'll keep it snappy. And what I hope to offer is kind of a broad sense, again, a very holistic sense at some of these key issue areas, and strongly encourage anyone interested. I'm happy to reach out. My email's on the first slide you can see later, or find me on the website. I'm very happy to continue conversations later. Strategic minerals. First set, upstream. So much is happening. I'm not going to try to cover everything. A couple things that I will note. We are looking at a wholesale shift in where source comes from. There are 2 very different sides of this, though. In particular, and again, this is going to be a little US-China centric, but bear with me, because I think right now, in terms of evolving geopolitical risks, these are the epicenters. First of all, is a very government-led push out of the US and more broadly out of the partnerships that it and various Western developed economies have put together, as well as Australia, Japan, and Korea to a certain extent. The key issue basically revolves, as many will know, around concerns over Chinese dominance, generally called, in upstream minerals. This comes largely down to processing, but increasingly focus on extraction too. I want to provide a counterpoint. What is the Chinese side of this view? And this is my bread and butter. What I track daily is Chinese investment, both government, really a lot of market, a lot of private-led investment as well. It comes down to supply. This is an economic issue more than a political issue. And so a lot of that outbound investment is driving 2 things. 1, increased fear around further Chinese dominance as Chinese investment increases, which pushes the US and partners to push harder on China, which increases supply concerns, which causes more investment, and so forth. So there's that issue of a feedback loop. And secondly, the others would be better to speak to than I would, frictions with resource economies. We've seen tensions with Chile in lithium space. We've seen tensions in various parts of, I mean, frankly, most resource economies. You can pick your favorite location. The issue is ultimately this feedback loop. There are 2 different things going on here, the political and the economic side. The key issue that we're seeing and that we're worried about over the next 5 to 10 years is that various extractive states will be pulled further toward sides. And this is going to be a very corporate level issue. That said, one of the key things to focus on here is how do we resolve this, geographically resolve, and also in terms of segment, resolve the different types of risk. When it comes to extraction, of course, it just depends on a given country's resource allocation. This is geological. This is not a technological issue so much as a geological issue. So in that case, there's only so much that can change. China could ramp up its own domestic production of certain minerals. That's not true of all of them. And I'm very happy to talk, especially around things like rare earths, particular deposits and their compositions. It's very detailed. On the other side, processing is a completely different ballgame where you can actually import the raw resource. And so we're looking at a combination of technology and scaling of processing technologies. China broadly dominates many, not all, but many of the key minerals important for the energy transition. transition. So right now, one of the key things we're obviously everyone's watching is friendshoring. But I want to look ahead more broadly than just that. The question is not, will developed economies outside of China attempt to invest in these technologies? It's, can they actually reach scale such that they can be competitive in cost? And or if they're not, will they actually have the willingness to move ahead with higher cost raw resources to fuel their energy transitions through more domestic and friendshoring production? There are a number of issues around that will basically tie directly to demand structure later on. So it's not a foregone conclusion. I want to make that very clear about the future trajectory of processing. Utilization is going to really tie into the midstream. I'll talk about that in a minute. A couple of things to note. One thing I always like to talk about is when we talk about critical minerals, what exactly are we talking about, right? And many different countries have different lists. Japan and Korea also have their own lists. Other key economies here have their own lists. In the US, called critical minerals list. In China, translated strategic materials. EU has its own list. But we put together a little graphic of, actually, I think aluminum is now joining the EU list. I have to confirm that. But in general, here is the basic overlap. And I'll notice a few things. Some of the most important ones, right? Oops, sorry. I wanted some of the most important ones, especially in the energy storage space. I have to talk about storage because solar plus storage is going to be the future of increasing solar and broadly renewable energy absorption. We have to talk about energy storage in this picture as well. So with that noted, cobalt, right? For panels themselves, graphite, gallium germanium chips, looking at lithium, of course, again, for batteries, rare earths in just about everything, tantalum again for semiconductors, etc. Everyone is focused on these critical resources. Why does this matter? I think when we're looking ahead and trying to forecast what might happen, the first place we can look is what particular minerals have various governments already previously identified as key to their national and regional interests, their bloc interests in the case of the EU. So, for example, months and months ago, we ran a couple of exercises saying if China wanted to put in place some controls on certain critical resources, what could they put it on? We look at this list. Gallium and germanium popped out. Why? Not just because it's on the list. We're looking at the broad varieties, which are constricted in terms of available processing and supply. There's a few there. Which would hurt China as much as others. Lithium. So that one's a bit more of an economically tricky thing to control. Gallium, germanium, and a couple others were high on the list of it would be significant, but it wouldn't really hurt China to impose blocks on, etc. When we're looking at future risks, the first thing to go is look at what are the critical resources already identified. And again, from there, we can go policy by policy and see what the most likely impacts will be. Beyond that, there's a lot more to go there. I'm looking at time. I'm going to skip ahead. But just to give a sense of how we're kind of looking at these things and how we can have some kind of forward-looking assessment even before some of these developments occur. Geopolitical risk, it's never occurring in a vacuum. There's always a trace and a trail pointing back because policymakers are acting on much of the same information the rest of the public is. They're looking at the same set of options. And we can be, if we're clever about it, anticipatory about potential actions. Green tech, infinite depth here. And I'm going to do basically something that pains me, which is to run roughshod right over kind of a very high level view. But beyond the particular, and again, the most interesting, I'd love to get into details of technologies here. But at a very high level, the two things I really want to come away with is there are two very different things happening. In much of the West, again, looking at US-driven political fears and the way it's rallied, one, political support for industrial policy in the US, which is almost unheard of in recent decades. The IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and a number of global analogs. The EU has multiple plans in this regard. Japan, Australia have their own, and obviously they're for independent motives as well. But there was also an element of just basically trying to keep up now that there are massive subsidization programs happening out of the US specifically to counter China. It's cast in many ways, let there be no doubt. This is an explicit response to China. And politically, where this comes from is basically a threat narrative in the US. Chinese control over US it's always talked about in terms of dominance. That means China could hold leverage over the US, and this is a very terrifying kind of situation. That's generally speaking obviously I'm not giving it much nuance, but ultimately that's what it boils down to. And yet we look at the Chinese investment patterns. What does it say? It says it's really driven by domestic interests, right? And so in Washington, you might hear about China strategically controlling various industries and parts of the supply chain, et cetera. And we look back over 30 years of investment, upstream, midstream, downstream, and obviously there are huge degrees of politics around all of this investment, but the fundamental driver, generally speaking, is industrial economic upgrading, having a sustainable long-term economic trajectory. And we see a massive amount of investment coming from specific private companies and from local governments that are trying to claim their place in an evolving economy. So for example, more recently, we're seeing a small number of small cities, some in Guangdong, which are looking and saying, hey, we missed out on the battery revolution. We missed out on solar panels. We're not going to miss out again on something else like offshore wind. So now we see a competition that is completely not central government related among these small city governments and small private actors that are saying we can dominate the space if we just push ahead. And so seeing massive investment there, which again, back in Washington, looks threatening. And so because we have this, it's again another feedback loop that we're very concerned will evolve, partly because of assumptions from outside of China about what's happening. This is, of course, one of many, but one of the key catalysts to my mind that's driving global geopolitical risks. It's not just sanctions risk, that's a huge one. It's also specific actions to undercut certain supply chains, to kind of replace certain supply chains. On the other hand, massive subsidy opportunities playing out across developed economies that did not have this degree of subsidization recently, so there are upsides. But at the same time, what we're very worried about is that spiral in terms of misperception and each kind of feeding the fear and driving greater reaction. The West tends to be very reactive to this kind of development, sometimes for good reason, sometimes for more questionable political motives. But the fact is there's this ongoing feedback loop. We can get into some of the details later. Again, we need to kind of break this up though. What technology are we talking about? And this is a very rough cut, because again, 20 minutes, but a couple of the kind of broadly different things. I think the outlooks are very different for kind of current commercialized solar tech, looking at advanced solar tech, looking especially at perovskites. I mean, some of the Chinese private actors right now are making incredible strides in commercializing perovskites by reducing degradation rates, things of that nature, that are building on decades of work by other countries, national laboratories, et cetera, for example. But there's a huge question of how that gets commercialized. And lastly, grid-side energy storage, and some more distributed energy storage. But I'm going to focus on grid-side because it's still a very nascent industry. But control over that, it just looks very different. So as we're trying, as everyone kind of looks, especially particular companies, try to look at how to navigate these geopolitical risks. The first is understanding the big picture, which again, all the stuff up here. And then second, slotting in your particular technologies of interest, particular products of interest, into which type of demand, which type of threat vector and risk structure applies to them. And I want to highlight very quickly, I have 4 minutes left, I want to highlight very quickly a few different things. For key tech considerations, these are kind of three of the main things we track, seeing who can produce these, and especially as we see some foreign efforts to influence global supply chains, specifically of these technologies. First is wafer cuts. This is important, but less of a salient issue. This is not typically of the order of technical magnitude of semiconductors, that kind of thing. However, wafer types, thin film and the various ways you can achieve thin film. I'm looking specifically at cadmium telluride in the West and some other technologies being pioneered in China. Control over those technologies is going to be a huge risk vector, and we will probably see specific government actions around some of these technologies here soon. And then looking more forward-looking to advanced solar tech. The perovskite's probably first on the docket, but there's a lot of other stuff to consider there. Each of these is going to have a slightly different demand structure, and again, it comes back to what has captured political attention? And what has captured political attention largely depends on demand. One of the key things I really want to focus on is which types of investment, which types of political action, which type of kind of focus is really driving the most salient risk over the next 5 to 10 years. We kind of know what the risks are right now, but what are they in 5 to 10 years? This is a very kind of blunt statement of the situation, but my sense generally is that the more you see demand for any technology grow, especially in the US's case, less so in Europe, but especially in the US and broadly in the West, the more you see demand grow in the West, the more you'll see accelerated geopolitical risk associated with these particular technologies, because the West wants to compete broadly. And again, these are very gross terms. I apologize for lack of nuance given time constraints, but generally speaking. Whereas a lot more of the investments in emerging economies, there's much more of a broad industrial and economic growth perspective. It's a little bit less specific risk. And partly, frankly, we have seen certain emerging economies struggle to deal bilaterally with Chinese investment. It's kind of take it or leave it in many cases, whereas massive economies that can pull together that actually have weight to counterbalance China's capacity. That's where we're seeing increased action because, frankly, there's increased capability to have or to take action. What does this mean for specific companies? One is looking at particular segments, right? I'm going to get to a case study here in a second. Actually, let's get to the case study in a second. First is that geographic diversification is going to help. It's going to be tricky. A lot of companies already, we talk to them, and they're already facing a significant pressure to align. If you're a Chinese company, well, it's kind of foregone right now. But for all other companies, we see a lot of companies that have ties to a particular country and are based in Singapore. How do they navigate this stuff? And a lot of it comes down to these perceptions, especially in the capitals in the West, of where they're aligned. So I'm going to end on this slide. Back to the demand side, a couple good case studies. In the US needs battery technologies, and China is able to provide them. Ford, major US provider of automobiles, partnered with CATL, the battery company out of China, the biggest. Panned, political uproar. Half of Congress tried to block the deal. Why? For a lot of reasons, but part of my argument is that the US electric vehicle sector is pretty tiny. It's not a huge market, and so there's not, frankly, as much driver right there. On the other hand, the US is a massive growth market for solar panels. JA Solar invests in US-based solar capacity. Guess what gets politically applauded? Everyone loves it. Not a surprise, it follows demand structure. European policy is a bit more mixed, but similar kind of, I'll be very curious the EU experts seeing how that balances out over various specific countries. EU generally tends to be a bit more economically driven and less politically reactive in some ways. Certainly it is reactive, but not quite as extensively. And the last note here, Chinese companies that we can tell, yes, they're supportive of broad government goals, but the broad government goals tend to be grow the economy, upgrade industrial capabilities, etc. We see Chinese companies going wherever there are opportunities. That means emerging economies. That means developed economies. And one of the key risk factors right now is perceptions, the differing perceptions of those across segments. And again, one of the things I want to add to the conversation is that perceptions are not simply about what technologies a given country has or doesn't have. It's also about a given government's perceptions of its own demand structure over the next little while. So I've got a minute over, I apologize, but thank you very much for your time. Look forward to the Q&A. Feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Corey. So it's great to hear from you, just sort of a very broad overview of looking at the geopolitical risk, namely very much focused on U.S. and China, Chinese companies. How is that paint the whole picture in terms of the energy transition and how it might impact the developers and businesses. So I'm just gonna give a shout out to the audience right now. So that'd be a good time to put in some of your questions. If there's anything you want to ask Corey about, feel free to put it in the chat box. So we'll get to them later on in the Q&A session. So next up, I'm going to introduce Dr. Pakalchuk, head of the research group for climate and energy and senior researcher at NUPI. So a brief introduction, he writes, he's been writing a lot about economic reform, climate change, and trade and energy governance. And part of his work involves giving advice to on these topics to government institutions and international organizations within the regions in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe as well. So today he's going to be focusing a lot on the geopolitical risks posed by the Ukraine war specifically, how that impacts on the energy transition development, and also focusing on the how that impacts on the energy supply chains, looking at some of these critical materials that are essential to, for example, solar energy and wind turbines as well. So while I was doing my research on him, I just found out a very interesting fact as well, that he can actually speak fluently in 6 languages, Russian, Ukrainian, German, French, and even Norwegian as well, in addition to English, of course. I just thought it's kind of interesting. And I'm going to greet him with my very broken German. Guten Tag, Dr. Pakalchuk. I'm going to pass it on to you. Guten Tag, yeah. So over to you, please. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bonnie, for your kind introduction. I was nearly basically got surprised that I thought you would ask me to to speak in German, but good that because I presented and prepared in English. So if you could share my slides, because I didn't manage to fix this on my side. And then I could just say a few words about myself. I'm head of the Climate and Energy Research Group at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. That's the Norwegian think tank, which is one of the leading think tanks in the country on issues related to foreign policy in general. And with our center, we've been working a lot on the issues related to the geopolitics of renewable energy, where we, back in 2017, started our collaboration with the Harvard University, understanding that this issue of energy transition and its different aspects, like the critical materials, like the renewable energy technologies, they may become central when it comes to the foreign policy and relations among different countries. And that's why this topic of geopolitics of critical materials has become so important to us as an institution. And in our center, we've been increasingly focused on critical materials and the geopolitics around it. So is it possible for you to start sharing slides?
Yeah, we're trying to, I wonder if, did you send it over? Because I think our colleagues weren't able to receive it just yet.
Right. Okay, no problem. I can just forward it to you again. Right. So, and I was basically asked today to speak about the war in Ukraine and its impact. And I should say that its impact has been quite different in different areas. So, on the one hand, the energy transition, which has been happening before the war, has gotten accelerated after the war in Ukraine. Well, for many different reasons, for the need to diversify, for example, energy sources, and especially such a region as Europe has become very much serious about the need to accelerate energy transition to reduce, for example, its energy dependence on Russia. But also in general, I think that there was understanding that it's important to adopt more renewable energy, also for the environmental reasons, for the reason of climate change and so on. So in some ways, on the one hand, the war has become quite an important, I would say, trigger for some of the processes in the energy transition that have been already in place. At the same time, it also, it raised some of the major issues that basically didn't exist before, such as, for example, it raised the need to, for example, look for new markets for some of the most important critical materials. Right, so now we have the slides, and I would like just to say that very much today I would like to talk a bit about the work that we've done together with the International Renewable Energy Agency. That is one of the, well, basically the only international organizations that focuses primarily on renewable energy. And over the last few years, this topic of critical materials has also become quite central in the work that they're doing. So in that sense, I'd like just to share and show you some of the slides from this report that our institute, so if you can just go to the second slide, please. So yeah, just this summer, in July, we published this new report, which basically reflects some of those points that Corey mentioned, and I fully agree with him in terms of how complex this whole terrain is, and that is going to be even more complex in the near future. So I think it's the time, and this is the reflection of our understanding that this is the time to talk about the geopolitics of energy transition in the light of the geopolitics of critical materials, and this is why we published this report. And if we can then go to the next slide, please. So this report was a big collaboration between different actors, where we tried to bring together different aspects that, and including risks and opportunities through the lens of the geopolitics. And one of the main contributions is probably something that already Corey mentioned, is the assessing of criticality of different materials. It seems there are some technical issues, so just move to the
slide. For a moment, I think they're just trying to bring it up again for you.
Okay, thanks. I'm waiting.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that, well, we did really big work in terms of trying to assess criticality of minerals from different perspectives, such as the resource allocation, such as the access to different supply chains, also the criticality from the point of view of scarcity, also technological development, the difficulty in terms of mining and so on. And then we put them together just to try to see the whole picture. And we came up, thank you, next slide, please. So we came up with this whole list of critical materials. I think it's just the complementary work that we've done already that existed in this whole area. As Corey mentioned, well, there is, of course, the EU lists, which are often updated. There's also a US list, and also from many other countries. So we tried to look at all of them, and in the end, we ended up having 35 such lists. And then we tried to see, we basically tried to sum up their main takes on the criticality, and we found that, well, basically it's cobalt, lithium, neodymium, nickel, and indium, and as you can see also there down the list, those are considered to be the most critical in the near future. But again, of course, it's very difficult to predict what is going to happen in the next few years. So of course, in some ways, some of those lists, they do projections up to the 2035, some others going even more long-term, showing the picture by 2050. So in that sense, of course, this is one of the disadvantages of this whole one generic list that is based on all other lists, is that, well, it includes different time frames. But that's the best what we could do in this area. But our whole point here is that, well, giving this, that so much attention is going to so many minerals compared, for example, to some of the others down the list, it's likely to predict even more competition around those minerals, including like the need to expand the production, given that, well, there's this, many predict enormous demand for most of those minerals. For example, for the germanium alone, it's predicted that its demand will grow by 8,000% by 2040. And similar numbers are actually for cobalt, lithium, which demand for which is going to increase by 1,000% in the near future, which of course raises this need to expand the existing mining production, as well as getting access to some of the existing supply chains by different big players, of course. But also now we see that even like some of the let's call them secondary players that didn't exist before, but now also increasingly interested in becoming important markets, are now also in the race to get those minerals. Next slide, please. You can see here also one interesting observation is that given this intensifying competition over critical materials, one can also observe the trend that there is also an increasing trend in terms of export restrictions. So it means that most of the countries, they are becoming more domestic oriented, and in that sense one can call them like there's this resource nationalism, that countries are aware of the growing value of those most minerals, and that's why more and more different types of export restrictions are being applied to those minerals. As you can see on that figure, well, basically, like germanium, cobalt, platinum really require additional export restrictions to be lifted in order to be able to, for example, to export them abroad. This also has implications, of course, for the supply chain markets, and in some ways results in higher prices and well, abrupt prices also, kind of in terms of like sudden increases quite recently. And of course, the war in Ukraine led to the fact that some of the minerals are now being under high demand for, such as, for example, nickel, where Russia has been one of the main producers of this mineral. But now, of course, with the war in Ukraine and, of course, the impact of sanctions, there's a need to diversify this market for nickel. And there's a kind of growing race for such mineral, and also the need to find and expand, and maybe also kind of to launch new mining sites for this mineral. Next slide, please. So in our report and in our study that we did under the project together with the IRENA, we tried to look at some of the, some of the general types of risks when it comes to the mineral supply chains. And as you can see, there are different types of risks for every stage of the supply chain. So starting from exploration, then mining, transportation, processing, and ending up with the intertech substitution, we see that different dimensions of risks apply differently. So of course, one can talk about geopolitical changes, and you can see that this red color shows that this is where we project most of the risks to be. The same relates, for example, to regulatory changes. Again, exploration, mining, some of the critical phases, because, well, countries have control over their resources. And now we also see this trend of increasing resource nationalism, which was also to some extent, I think, well, basically has been increased by the war in Ukraine. And also technological changes, which of course are, well, quite uncertain to the degree that these changes happen quite, well, more at a, well, I would say at a more frequent pace compared, for example, to some of the geopolitical or regulatory changes. And this is where you see that most of the risks, kind of the higher impact on supply chain can be found starting from processing, efficiency of use, recycling, and intertech substitution. Next slide, please. So in a sense that if we want to group different types of geopolitical risks to the supply chains, they can be categorized according to the 6 different groups. And I think to a large extent, this is complementary what Corey was basically telling us. So of course, we still have this impact and even growing impact of external shocks, not least caused by the climate change, something that we've been facing with over the last 2 years. As I said, the increasing resource nationalism, I've come across a study that showed that more than 70 countries have actually made their legislation when it comes to the mining of resources even more difficult for foreign investors over the last few years. It means that some of those legislation and regulatory frameworks have become more difficult to deal with, or at least they become more demanding for different investors. The same again, as I said before, and I showed you the slide on export restrictions. Then some expect the soon emergence of mineral cartels that might, use the markets for different minerals and supply chains differently, also in their own interests, by creating such cartels, including with the impact on the pricing policies, markets allocation, and so on. We also know that the rapid expansion of mining activities, especially in some of the most politically unstable countries, could even intensify political instability and social unrest in those countries, where you also have the issues such as corruption, existing violence, and so on. And finally, of course, this issue of market manipulation that comes into play, that, well, you also have these factors being very important. Next slide, please. I think this slide is not fully shown, but the point here is that we also did another additional study where we try to see why there's this, very much growing argument of scarcity of those minerals. And I think it's partly driven by the fact that this the whole data landscape is quite opaque in the sense that different type aspects of the supply chain markets for critical materials controlled by different actors, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I mean, in the end, it leads to the fact that there's this high perception of uncertainty around different types of minerals, about supply chain markets, and as a result, this gives this understanding that, well, the market for most of those minerals is scarce, and of course the reserves are also scarce. And we know that when it comes to scarcity, this often leads to some of the, the projection of fear that, well, there may be not enough minerals. So there's this at the global level, at the level of global governance, when it comes to critical materials, there's this need to to unite more players together in order to have more unified data about the different types of critical materials, and it should be put together in order to really have a kind of a bigger picture and understanding of things that might have that could happen in the near future, while now many different actors have to do kind of their own research and often lack data and understanding as well as information on those markets, including actually the central governments in many countries, which actually complain, and this is also like they sent many different types of official complaints to the IRENA, asking them to provide more data on the different types and subsets of critical materials markets. The next slide, please. So just to give you like the summary of the points that I made is that what's happening now after the Ukraine war is that supply chains are to some extent deglobalizing, but at the same time are also reglobalizing. It means that many different market players are trying to find new partners. For example, when it comes, of course, to China, it's now actively looking for new partners. And I can say that, for example, China recently set many new deals, for example, with Central Asia countries which also have many different critical materials. Also other countries like, for example, and regions like, for example, the EU, they are also looking for new sources of supply, and this is what's called friendshoring. For example, the EU is trying to find and cooperate with friends in the global south, trying to find new supply markets and rely not only on China. So in a sense, also, I should say that, well, some of the geopolitical tensions that are rising relate pretty much to the decline of the fossil fuels, which also have, some reserves of critical materials. So, and this is where we see some of the more serious implications of the energy transition, and not in the growth of the renewables. Of course, this critical materials part is important, but the growth of renewables per se, at least for now, is carrying fewer risks compared to some of the decline of the existing, for example, fossil fuel countries. So in that sense, stranded geopolitical assets becoming more real in those countries. So countries that relied heavily on the use of oil and gas, they seem to be now in a kind of on a shaky ground, as there's already some evidence that some of the countries that adopt more renewable energy, they tend to also import less fossil fuels. That already has some implications for some of the neighbors. And here again, we can take the case of, for example, Russia or China. I should also say that the intensifying competition over critical materials makes important and maybe also makes some of the new markets very important in this whole competition game, because like it used to be that, well, it's mainly China or like some of the biggest countries that had the biggest reserves of critical materials. They have been at the forefront of the energy transition. But now with the increasing demand, it means that some of the secondary markets that used to be not so important, and for example, those countries that have fewer reserves are now also becoming more important, and probably we'll see them also becoming important geopolitical players. So we will talk not only about the US, China, and European countries, but also some of the other, medium-sized countries that have enough reserves to make a substantial contribution to the global markets and global supply chains. And on the my final point is that, of course, this mining aspect of critical materials shouldn't be also forgotten from this whole picture, because we project that most of the burden would be on the developing countries, for the mere fact that it's way easier to launch and expand the mining sites in the developing countries, where you don't have the strong regulatory framework, and it usually takes less time compared, for example, to some of the countries, for example, in the European Union, where well, it takes many years to develop new mining sites. And if we go to the next slide, you can actually see that we traced lead times for different critical materials. And you can see that in general, that from discovery to first production, it takes different time periods for different materials. And of course, in that regard, copper is the most difficult to produce. So here we talk about new mining sites, right? But then also zinc, lead, nickel, they also take many years in terms of the production, which means that opening new mining sites is not the best response, or cannot be the only response to the rising demand for critical materials. So in that sense, this brings us to the point that it's important to look at the existing mining sites, and this is also what companies do, that probably in order to accelerate this getting access and expand the supply of critical materials, it's important to cooperate with countries and companies which are already producing some of those minerals, because again, new mining site takes many years, and especially again in countries where you have very strong regulatory regime. In many countries, mining is even banned. So in that sense, it's actually countries, again, like Congo, many countries in Africa or Southeast Asia, that are likely to see this, increasing interest from mining companies to enter the markets and start the expansion. But then again, if it's not sustainable, then this can again lead to many, many destructive implications. Something that we've been witnessing in the Democratic Republic of Congo for many years, right? So there's this increasing need and challenge to promote and, of course, expand the mining, but then it also has to be more sustainable in order to make sure that the impact on the environment is limited. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, or danke. So thank you so much, Roman, for your holistic sharing. And just to give a quick summary just now, that some of the things that he shared, it was how these supply chains are actually deglobalizing, and to some extent also reglobalizing, from a different perspective. And then you ended on posing the point about the mining aspect of some of these critical materials, and I thought this is the great way to kind of segment into our next speaker, who's going to be talking a lot about some of the human rights perspective concerning the mining sector, because then some of the research from Carolyn will be very much focused on these issues in the mining sector. So let me just give a quick introduction to Carolyn. So she's the senior researcher with the Natural Resources and Just Transition team at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So her research, as I said, focuses a lot on corporate policies and practices in renewable energy value chains. And prior to that, she was an advocacy officer at Oxfam in France, with a focus on climate and human rights, as well as tax justice issues in the extractive sector. So like I said, she'll be sharing with us some of her research findings on human rights abuses concerning the energy business, especially in the mining sector. And she'll also be telling us more about how we can ensure an energy transition that is just and successful. So that kind of ties in back to some of the points that Roman made about, some of the lack of regulations in the developing countries, and looking for new mining sites and sourcing of the critical materials. So on that note, let me pass it on to Caroline.
Thanks, Bonnie, and pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. So thanks so much. So I'm gonna just say a few words on our organization to start off today. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center. We are an international human rights organization that's dedicated to advancing human rights in business and eradicating corporate abuse. So if you could go to the next slide, please. What we have been doing for 20 years is collecting allegations of human rights abuses in connection to business activities across across different geographical sectors and activities. And we also have been focusing on developing our in-house capacity and resources on salient thematic priorities from a business and human rights perspective. And so the team that I work in and for which I lead the research on, looks at the rights of communities with regards to responsible use of natural resources and a just transition. So this is what we are going to discuss today. You can see on the screen here different publications we have released pretty recently. And so I'm going to try to take you in less than 20 minutes through some of the findings from our latest research. And so what I'm going to do is to try to zoom in on the social and human rights risks that are associated with navigating global mineral supply chains. And some of the comments that have been made by previous speakers really resonated with me. One thing that we see very clearly is the fact that increasing demand, geopolitical tensions, also temptation to source from some countries and not others, are also drivers that increase the risk of abuses to human rights and local communities. And so that's something that also comes out pretty strongly from our research. If you could go to the next slide, please. So very quickly, just to say a few words from a contextual perspective, but we have already discussed that today in previous presentations, but that's also how we approach this question of human rights risk in renewable energy value chains. We know that climate change is the ultimate risk to human rights. That's an important framing. So there's no question about the fact that we need an energy transition that is fast. We know that this means that global installed solar capacity needs to increase pretty quickly, and the same for wind power. We need solar power capacity probably to increase by 6-fold in this decade, and wind power to quadruple. But what we also know, and that's what we know from our own research, is that the sector is absolutely not immune to human rights violations. And as I was saying, as pressure to scale up renewable global capacity intensifies, we also see the risk of impact occurring throughout the entire renewable energy value chain, also increasing. So that means that we see human rights risk in connection with the extractions of minerals that are necessary to build renewable energy equipment, as well as risk during the deployment phase of renewable energy projects. In particular, and that's what we know at the moment, there are salient risks in renewable energy value chain. One of them is, of course, and that has been highlighted by recent research by the Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. We know that there are serious concerns of forced labor taking place in the manufacturing of solar panels and polysilicon supply chains. We know that about 35% of global polysilicon supply chains may be exposed to that particular risk. What we also know from our own research is that there are significant risks to indigenous people in particular, and especially their rights that is recognized under international law to give free, prior, and informed consent to the exploitation of their land and resources. We also know that extraction of minerals that are necessary to build equipment essential for renewable energy operations, but also deployment of renewable energy projects or land-intensive operations. We also know that in a number of jurisdictions, the government's framework in place to ensure that land rights are respected, or when resettlement operations have to take place, are weak and somewhat insufficient, and that increases the risk of impact to human rights. And finally, there are also many elements that point out to significant risks to indigenous people, because we know that about half of the energy transition minerals and metals are located on or near the land of indigenous people. And so on the back of that, and I'm going to take you through some of the specific risks that we see, especially in relation to extraction of minerals. But we also know that renewable energy companies remain pretty unequipped to deal with the specific nature of those human and social risk. We published in 2021 our renewable energy benchmark, where we looked at policy and practices of 15 of the largest renewable energy companies. And what we saw is that no company had, for example, a policy committing to respecting land rights within their own operations that was sufficiently detailed. And barely 1/4 of all companies had policies in place to recognize and respect the rights of indigenous people. If you could go to next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give you some, and I'm going to try to be quite quick on this, some figures and some facts and figures from our latest research on human rights abuses in connection with mining for transition minerals. We look at allegations of human rights abuses in connection with extraction of cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc. We look at the biggest producing mines for each of those minerals, and we look at the types of human rights abuses that have been publicly reported across the globe. And we look at various trends and what we know from this collection of allegations of human rights abuses. We have launched our latest edition in June of this year. So far, in about a decade of recording those allegations of abuses, we have collected more than 500 allegations connected to about 1,500 impacts, which means that each case, each allegation of human rights abuse is connected to a variety of impacts on human rights. And those range from impact on the environment that communities live in to impact on the specific nature of indigenous people's rights, as I was saying. We know that the leading cause of abuse is abuse against local communities, and in particular, indigenous people living nearby mining operations. We also know that we have quite a big number of allegations that have an impact on both the environment and on local communities. If you can go to next slide, please. Thanks. So basic respect for human and environmental rights, which centers communities and workers and their right to participation and consent, should be a fundamental first step to achieving a just and sustainable energy transition. But what we know from our research as well is that less than half of the companies that are associated with allegations that we have collected have human rights policies in place. And that doesn't even say whether it's a good policy or not, or whether it's actually in place. So that is a very poor performance that shows that there is significant room for further improvements. We also know that 2/3 of the allegations that we have collected are related to only 14 companies. And we also know that about 1 in 5 allegation is related to a Chinese headquartered company. So we see there the implication of the development of Chinese investments abroad, and I'm going to speak to that in a minute. But this has also implication in terms of increasing number and risk to social and human rights. If you could go to next slide, please. And so lastly, on the type of risk that we see in associated with mining for transition minerals, we also see significant risk of attacks against human rights defenders, and that's about 1 in 4 allegations that we have collected. And so very often those attacks, and what we call an attack, range from physical attacks and in some cases killings to cases of arbitrary detention, but also restriction of freedom of expression, and also something that we see in a number of countries, the use of what we call SLAPs, which are strategic lawsuits against public participation, or you could call them frivolous lawsuits. And so we see a continuum between risk of impact on the environment and water pollution in particular, communities taking actions against those impact, conflict dynamics increasing in a particular location, and then attacks against community members when they act as defenders. And so this happens in a number of places. And of course, one of the most famous case probably is the Las Bambas mine in Peru, which is associated with the highest number of allegations on our tracker and is operated by China Minmetals. If you could go to the next, please. Thanks. So on this, we also have conducted separately research on human rights risk in connection with Chinese mining overseas investment. So looking at mines outside of China that are owned by Chinese company, and not only mines, actually. We looked also at licensing and processing operations in relation to 9 major minerals in the renewable energy sector: cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, nickel, zinc, chromium, aluminium, and rare earth elements. We used a similar methodology as for the global transition minerals tracker that I've just presented to record allegations of human rights abuses. What we saw is that many projects that are invested by Chinese companies are located in resource-rich countries, which often have weak governance and limited options for victims of abuse to seek remedy. And this is also compounded by an absence of legislation in China mandating extraterritorial human rights and environmental due diligence. So without taking you through all the numbers that you can see on the screen, because you can also see them in our briefing, but again, like lots of negative environmental impacts on workers' rights in particular, and also a lack of human rights policies being in place among Chinese companies. So this highlights the fact that despite important advances that have been promised by and promoted by the Chinese government and the China Chamber of Commerce of Metals and Minerals, there's still a lot of room for improvement, and this is important to take into consideration as the energy transition move forward. If you could go to next slide, please. So just to try to sum things up quickly and offer some perspective on the just transition from a business and human rights perspective. As I said, climate change, the ultimate risk to human rights, and that close connection is gradually being recognized. We know that there was a UN resolution in July 2022 recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. And so against all of this and this background of risk to human rights that are being compounded and increased as a result of geopolitical tensions and increasing demand from the West in particular, many civil society organizations have been asking for greater business actions for companies to respect their obligations to respect human rights. You can see here on the screen a letter that we coordinated with more than 200 organizations ahead of the last COP, asking the UN, ASECCC, and state parties to put human rights at the center of climate action and to ask for further consideration and integration of the protection of all human rights, and especially the specific rights of indigenous people in the energy transition. I mean, in our view, there's no question that the energy transition needs to be fast, but in order to be fast, it actually needs to be fair to retain broad public support, and especially in emerging markets where those tensions are more salient. Next slide, please. Just as I'm probably running a little bit out of time, I'm going to wrap up this. Like, we have developed our own perspective on what constitutes a just transition from a business and human rights perspective. Important for governments, companies, and investors to commit to 3 core principles: building shared prosperity, looking at effective business models that can drive a fast transition and that also share some of the benefits with local communities, social protections and human rights, and also committing to consultation and consent and getting the free, prior, and informed consent of all communities. And on this, just to give a little bit of an example, if you can go to next slide, please. One thing that we see as a promising avenue and also an emerging trend in the sector in terms of moving towards a more rights respecting energy transition is building shared prosperity through co-ownership models. Here I'm talking about equity models in which local communities, indigenous communities in particular, acquire an equity stake in a project, and then they can derive from that project benefits, but also access to the governance and really getting a seat at the table. And so such approaches are grounded in a different kind of a vision and moving on from seeing them as stakeholders that need to be consulted as integral part of the project, really can deliver on a more rights-respecting energy transition. And we see those models being adopted in Canada now, but also increasingly in other countries like Australia in the region. Next, please. Some recommendations for governments: prioritize access to energy that is important to retain broad public support, adopt regulatory and legislative frameworks that mandate human rights and environmental due diligence, and also promote models, business models that can build co-ownership. And also finally, and that's also a very important point, support recycling and reusing of minerals and increase efficiency in product design to minimize the impact of mining. We also know that we have to work on demand and demand for new minerals in order to manage those risks to human rights and social and on social aspects. Next, please. Companies should adopt human rights policies, but also human rights due diligence and assign clear board responsibility to manage for risk throughout the entire renewable energy supply chain and at the highest level of the company. They should also consider a clear commitment to co-ownership model, at least to explore areas and modalities by which they can better share some of the benefits and the profits from particular mining or also renewable energy operations. And last slide, next slide, sorry, thank you. And so finally, like investors also can use their leverage, and we can decide, investors investing into renewable energy companies, but also mining companies. We see a number of investors and coalitions really building on their leverage, and at the moment being quite vocal and active on engaging with companies on improving their business conduct from a human rights perspective, and that is something that needs to continue and in the energy transition. So being an active investor. Thank you. I think if you could go to next. Thank you. I will stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Caroline, for your sharing. I think it's very important that that from her presentation is able to shed some light on the human rights issues and how that is becoming more of a risk in our fight for climate change. And we certainly don't want a green energy transition progress that is at the expense of the rights of us humans. And so one thing to highlight as well is that, some of the things that was mentioned as well, how corporate responsibilities and also better regulations in addressing these human rights issues would be really something that we need to look into a bit more. So before we go on to the next session, I just wanted to remind our fellow audience that if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to put it in the chat box and we'll address them in our Q&A session. And in the meantime, so I guess we'll kickstart with our moderated Q&A session. And so I figured that to make things a little bit more interactive, I wanted to start off by inviting our speakers to ask each other questions. Because I think, some of the topics are very much overlapping and also has very close relations to each other. So I don't know if any of you might want to start first. I'm going to toss it maybe perhaps over to Corey if you have any questions for our other speakers that you would be interested to find out.
Absolutely, thank you. Honestly, too many questions to actually ask in this time allotted. But what are the major kind of this might not be a particularly precise question, but I'm curious both of your perspectives. we have so many different governance regimes. We have investment governance, we have national security governance increasingly involved, and then we have, I would argue, not enough of the type of governance pertinent to the last presentation there. So I'd be curious on both of your perspectives. Are any countries leading the way successfully in having both a truly sustainable governance regime that is sustainable environmentally and climate, socially, ethically, as well as economically? Have you seen success in cases that we should follow, especially as we see so many governments kind of have a fragmented governance, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I guess this might be something that Roman can maybe start off addressing from, on a government level, governance in some of these regulations, and maybe Caroline can also maybe chip in on a bit more from a human rights perspective in regulating some of these issues as well, just to add to that. So maybe Roman can give some.
Sure. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Cor, for your very good question. This is another area where we are working at the moment. And what we did recently, we looked at, first we tried to identify all possible governance initiatives when it comes to critical materials and in such areas as sustainable mining, as the mining for the need of the energy transition. And I should say that we identified 8 different governance initiatives, which is a lot. We didn't expect so many to be. Some of them are established around some of the specific minerals, like there's this International Zinc Association, I think, but then there are more general associations that tend to cover many different minerals. Some of them are country-specific, some of them more regional, but also there are some global ones. And I should say that what we also learned so far is that there's a pretty limited coordination between them, which probably makes the whole governance architecture quite fragmented, and of course, which doesn't really help. At the same time, the fact that there are so many initiatives and many of them have been established after 2015, which means that most of them are a response to the to the needs of the energy transition, is probably a promising sign that, well, there's more increasing attention from different countries to really improve the mining and basically increase the mining standards, as well as the make the whole processing phase, recycling phase, even more sustainable than before. However, when it comes to that, to your question about who are some role models, it's pretty difficult to say, well, some of the countries are really leading. I think some of those countries which have been successful and apply the highest standards in terms of mining probably are located, for example, in the European Union. However, it being so advanced also means that they're extremely slow to initiate and launch new mining projects and sites. And now that's because of that, there's now increasing attention from the European institutions in Brussels to actually to try to fast track this whole process of obtaining license and then, for example, providing opportunities for European mining companies to basically to promote and start new mining projects within Europe at a much faster speed compared to some of some previous experiences. So usually in Europe it takes 5 to 15 years to actually start a new mining project. So now there's this discussion about the fast track. So the key question is it possible to actually reconcile the speed with the high sustainability standards in terms of mining? This is something we'll see, but it's really difficult to say whether it's possible. But at least it's now being very much discussed, and there are different initiatives from the European parliamentarians and the delegates to really try to find a way to fast track the whole process. I hope to manage somewhat to answer your question.
Yeah, that's very good. What about Caroline? Do you want to maybe chip in also a bit about, maybe some of the examples on if there's any role models or some kind of things that are already in place to address some of these issues from a human rights perspective within the sector?
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, just a few comments on this. We don't see any countries as today really leading on all dimensions that you mentioned, Corey. But we see interesting developments in different countries. I mentioned Canada in my presentation. This is a country where we see the most advanced government framework in terms of promoting what you could call like alternative business models from a governance perspective that better protects the rights of indigenous communities in the west of Canada in particular, and really gives them easier access to capital financing as well in order to become equity shareholders of renewable energy projects. So this is something that has been tried and tested in Canada, and that is considered like something that is quite promising to build a more lasting energy transition. And I should say that such models are also used in the mining sector. We also see other countries such as Sierra Leone, for example, in Africa, adopting really strong laws on requiring free, prior, and informed consent from communities before starting or extending mining operations. And also, like on the African continent, we also see South Africa moving into legislation where not legislation, actually, like policies, national policy on access to equity shareholding possibilities for local communities in renewable energy project. And then finally, there are also many countries looking at reforming their tax system around mining operations, which is something we did not discuss today, but is also an integral part of building a sustainable and benefit sharing mining sector in a number of countries, in a number of resource-rich countries. Chile, for example, adopting a new legislation on increasing royalties from mining operations. But I think all those developments and how they play out together and how they emerge really result from the political nature of mining in a specific country, and also, of course, domestic interest and relations between, and how we can play out those resources with in their relation with countries in the West, such as the EU, for example, trying to access resources in a number of countries.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on your point as well, like with some of these things that they're trying to do, and also the lack of, I guess, progress on, addressing these human rights issues within the sector. What might be, in your point of view, what might be some of the difficulties or some of the challenges that are hindering the progress on addressing these? And also on that note, because you're talking about 1,400 plus cases over the course of 12 years, I would say. So I think it is a significant figure, but I'm sure that there are still a lot of these other cases that are probably, that we haven't really, that hasn't been recorded, or, that are still, unreported as well. So chances are the situation is probably much worse than, that it's than the data is presenting. So I was just wondering, some of the on this aspect, what are the challenges that are hindering the progress on this?
Yeah, and very, very, very clearly, the data that we have should be seen as the tip of the iceberg. We look at public records, media sources, reports from local organizations, also court cases, and so we know that, yeah, like this also depends on freedom of the press in particular countries, and some issues are probably not reported or underreported. So yeah, definitely just the tip of the iceberg, and there are probably many more cases happening. What is hindering today improvement? For sure, like weak governance frameworks in a number of countries, but also and this was just mentioned, like this pressure and to fast track a lot of projects, which really increases risk to cut corners on environmental and human rights regulation. Because yes, approving permits for mining operations can take some time, and doing thorough and proper community consultation can be pretty lengthy exercise. So as pressure to months to source more minerals, we also see without adequate measures being put in place, and including within the EU, because the EU was mentioned, but we also see this risk as increasing within the EU and at its borders. We saw recently the case of the Jadar mine, lithium mine in Serbia, and permits being cancelled as a result of very strong community opposition. And many sources also point out to a risk of increasing conflict between local communities and mining and mining companies inside the EU and outside the EU. And so one avenue, of course, like having in place strong human rights due diligence requirements is an important aspect. But there is another one as well, which is to try to avoid this mining for the sake of mining, because we fear we will not have enough minerals. For sure, we need a lot of minerals in the energy transition. There's no doubt about this. But we also need to question, like, how can we also act on demand to make sure it's kept at a level that ensures a fair transition for all. And there are many levels that can be activated by governments. And it's also looking at, recycling, reusing minerals, but also looking at smart policy choices in terms of investing enough into public transportation, decreasing the size of EV batteries, and also use of individual cars in general. And there are many studies at the moment pointing out to the possibility to reduce that pressure on opening mining operations and really fast tracking and cutting corners on regulations by also working on demand while still allowing a full energy transition that is fast.
Thank you very much. So before I go into some of the questions that our audience have asked, I just want to quickly check with Roman and Caroline. Do you have any questions for either Corey or for each other that you want to ask?
I have a question to Corey.
Yeah. Okay, let's go with Roman, and then Caroline can ask the next question. Okay, so yeah, Roman, go on.
Corey, it was really helpful and insightful when you talked about the technological development and the competition around it. So I'm just very curious about your take on the some of the future developments in this area. So how you think this whole competition between the US and China, but also between other actors developing, say, within the next 5 to 10 years? Do you feel like there will be even more monopolists in terms of the new technologies for renewable energy? Or do you feel like there can be more new players that might change the competition a bit? Thank you.
Thank you. No, love this question. I mean, certainly I'd love to have answers. I'll try to give it a shot at a few pieces. First, I've been talking with various folks recently about the IRA and some of the other kind of analogs globally, and the key question being, can this change supply? Can this change global supply? What's interesting is I think, especially in the advanced solar space and a few other key energy technologies, I would probably exclude wind turbines, ironically, considering that it was always the Europeans who led that market. And in some of the batteries I have questions about. But in the advanced solar space, there are a number of countries, let's say specific companies, that have made significant advances. And then certainly there seems to be a serious potential that, given the right amount of investment, both both private investment but coupled with government subsidies, there can be supply from outside of China. I think there's little question about that. The huge question to my mind, though, is which markets does that new supply influence? And I think, so for example, the US might be able to supply some of its own demand with domestic companies, for solar in particular, I'm looking at. And this is true of a few other segments and markets. But I don't know to what degree they can ever compete on cost in kind of comparable technologies in the near term. And that's not just because of scale. Scale is obviously part. It's not just because of things like labor costs. It's not just because of things like regulation. It's also because of the vertical integration across upstream, midstream, and downstream production within each component and within each particular final good. It's just hard to compete. China has about a 25 to 30 year head start on developing many of these supply chains. So the question then becomes, to me, that's not the end of the road. Some analysts have said, well, can't compete on cost, that's it. I don't think that's the end. It's the start of another discussion. And the next discussion is to what extent does each respective locality price in the benefits of supply chain security, of national security, however they're asked, appropriately or other ways. I'm not here to comment on various political perceptions, but given what they are, there is a premium on, to some extent, localizing certain supply chains. And so to me, it's a question of what is the dollar or renminbi or euro value of that localization? Are you willing to pay the price difference for local supply? That is a question I do not have any answers to, but I think ultimately that's what it comes down to. Summarizing, I think yes, Korea, Japan, many countries in the EU, potentially Vietnam, can compete, including in the high-end tech sectors, including in advanced solar and in energy storage. But I'm not sure about what premium various actors will be willing to pay. I hope that's something of an answer so far.
Well, that's excellent. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, okay. So, and then for Caroline, did you have a question?
I have a very related question. Actually, I wanted to ask both of you if you could share any thoughts on how do you see like this really clearly signaled risk of forced labor in Xinjiang being widely reported on and affecting a lot of the solar panels that are made globally, and how is that pushing localization of manufacturing of solar panels in other regions, and how is it affecting in general what other countries may be planning out in terms of building on facilities for manufacturing of solar panels, and also making of solar modules and polysilicon modules.
Okay, so maybe Corey can start first. I think that was something, Xinjiang was something that you also briefly touched on, or at least mentioned in your PowerPoint. So we can go with Corey, and then if Roman has something to add, we'll go to him.
Absolutely, I love this fantastic question, and we should touch base separately because I would love to hear your thoughts on this in more detail as well. Practically, a couple of comments I can add. One of the biggest changes we actually saw was domestically within China. A lot of companies that wanted to sell overseas, Chinese companies, private mostly, they have moved. A lot of them have started moving production out of Xinjiang. I mean, long and short. There's a related issue. This is the kind of expanding the circle of consideration. But the more broad question of Chinese solar panels, Xinjiang has been part of the political motivation for some of the sanctions and also some of the anti-dumping actions by the US. And I'd say anti-dumping in particular has moved a lot of that capacity into Southeast Asia. Vietnam specifically has been a huge beneficiary of this. And to its credit, the Vietnamese government is basically really taking advantage of it quite effectively, I think, so far, in trying to localize some of the technology and production capabilities. But a lot of that was driven by anti-dumping. The US is quite aware, to my knowledge, that basically Southeast Asia is being used to circumvent anti-dumping. It hasn't clearly staked a claim. It can't recognize this without taking action. It seems reticent to take clear action for mostly commercial economic reasons. But when it comes back to Xinjiang, that has basically a dual role in US conversations. One is it gets lumped into this kind of broader conversation about we should do more in China. And then you get the more specific targeted human rights questions, which frankly, I haven't seen have as much tangible impact in the rest of the market. What I have seen though is domestically, and again, it has been really interesting to watch, is a number of Chinese companies that said, look, we don't want to be associated. And there's a related issue I'll touch on quickly, but we're just going to move supply outside Xinjiang. Xinjiang, for its part, actually, I'll jump to another piece real quick. One of the key things that you'll be aware of, I'm not sure how much everyone else is aware, it's extremely difficult to track where specific components came from. And so there's a danger on one hand of being complicit in human rights abuses by not having clear tracking of, yes, maybe this component was produced in Shandong, but the parts come from Xinjiang, right? That's really hard to track. And so you could risk being complicit, or you could go the other extreme and just not buy any Chinese solar panels, which again is kind of how, just in case it's implicated. And that's where, again, the political conversation in the US has tilted a little bit lately. But the reality is it's really hard to track, to the point that we're aware of Chinese companies, private Chinese producers, who do not operate in Xinjiang, say, we don't know if some of our components are somehow coming from that part of the world, that part of the country, pardon me. And it's been a huge issue. So honestly, one of the biggest issues, and I've been pushing this for a long time, is within China for Beijing to take a stronger regulatory stance on tracking and sourcing, basically showing on certifications, basically, that can be relied upon. Because right now it's just so hard to trace. I'd love to hear what Ramon has to say as well.
And I don't specialize in this particular case, cannot really add much, but I would just like to take a more global take on what's happening with respect to the this issue of respecting and paying enough attention to sustainability of those mining projects. And coming back to our list of criticality, as you remember, there were like 35 different minerals. And we looked at 35 different national and international lists. So when you look at the criteria of criticality, basically you will be surprised that such considerations as environmental impact, so basically how much of the environmental harm each of the mineral can possibly do, is not really present among the criticality criteria. So it's mainly about these, the market access to minerals. It's about the reserve distribution. So some of the, essential market elements, but nothing when it comes to the, sustainability from the point of view of the environment, of the, paying attention to the, local communities, their health and so on. For example, nickel can be extremely, basically dangerous type of mineral, which is extracted and produced, and it brings so many environmental and health and other social costs to the communities that are engaged in producing it. So in that sense, this need to ensure the fast transition to renewable energy somehow forgets about the other side of it. So, and this is something we'll also work on. So basically how to add this environmental and human rights component to this whole framework of criticality of critical minerals. This is something that we plan to do in the near future.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so I think we're going to just quickly jump onto some of these questions from the floor, virtual floor. Here we have a question from, hang on, Miko Wong. So Miko's asking about how can countries effectively navigate and respond to the potential trade barriers, sanctions, or protectionist measures that may arise as a result of geopolitical tensions in the energy sector. So I don't know if who might want to give a stab at this?
An opening salvo, I suppose, for framing. I think there's actually, looking at these are all three excellent questions I'm looking at on my screen. I think they're very related. I think we can address parts of each. Ultimately, of course, the first question is which country? If you're a developing economy, are you a resource economy? Looking at the cases like Indonesia, it has a very activist nickel trade policy, specifically to protect its resource. If you're looking at somewhere like Chile, it's more diversified, but again, minerals are very key. You're looking at Vietnam, other Southeast Asian producers. You're looking at manufacturing policy more than extraction. If you're a developed economy, you're looking more at market access and things like that. So it's a great question. And the first point is to understand from each particular country's perspective, what is their core strategic interest? And it sounds very fundamental, but it gets overlooked a lot. What is the core underlying driver of the politics and economic planning in that given country? The next is to have basically a clear map of all of your sources and your sinks. Basically, I know kind of adapting some of the more emissions-oriented lingo, but in terms of if you are a producer of a certain good, knowing your full supply chain is not just about knowing what companies are in play. If you have a Chinese company in your supply chain that might be subject to sanctions, that's kind of key, that's kind of the obvious part. But I'd go broader than that, because you don't just care about what's in your supply chain, you care if what's in your supply chain has alternatives, if it can be replaced if need be. You need to know if you're going to have that adaptability, right? And so the first question is not just what are the other companies, but the broader context that's surrounding all of those companies. companies, right? So if you look and you're like, well, I can replace this one Chinese company that operates in Xinjiang with 5 other Chinese companies that operate in Xinjiang, obviously you haven't changed much. But as we increasingly look toward a more diversified set of supply, which is an assumption over the next 5 to 10 years, given all of the current investments in diversifying supply, let's assume that there are more diverse sources of supply. Go to each country, look at their key drivers, look at their policy focuses. As noted in this quote, and Caroline has very clearly shown, some of these countries are much better about the human rights side, about the environmentalist side, about the economic sustainability side, etc. So understanding those kind of drivers and constraints is, I think, first and foremost. From there, I would start whittling down to the company level, etc. The other side is basically the one biggest flaw we've seen with certain corporate strategies is making significant assumptions about supply in 10 years. It's very difficult to say exactly what supply chains will look like in 5 to 10 years. And so making sure you understand your product well enough to know how you can replace certain materials. Battery manufacturers are key in this. A lot of them are already looking at alternative minerals in case there is some political blow up over a particular chemical, a particular mineral in their particular chemical formulation. So really important to get down to that level. That's right.
So I think the next question here actually ties in very nicely to the first question. Basically looking on the, in the longer term, how do you envision the role of this whole geopolitical dynamics in terms of shaping the landscape in energy transition within Asia specifically? And, especially like we talked about some of the political interests and the frameworks that's been in place. And yeah, so just in general, how do you envision this in the longer term? Are we looking at a more hopeful picture, or is there going to be quite a lot of challenges that we still need, or barriers that we still need to overcome? So maybe I can go to Roman this time to get some insights from you.
Concerning Asia, yeah, it sounds good. So I think what we see now, we see that, well, Asia is becoming, and I'm here to talk about different parts of Asia, but definitely Asia is now at the forefront of the energy transition. If you look at, for example, the investment going in the Asian markets, it's really it's fascinating. I mean, it's some parts and particular countries like Vietnam, for example, are real success stories. And these countries show that, well, it's really possible to adopt advanced regulatory measures to simplify procedures for market entry for many countries. So Vietnam is a success story in terms of the solar energy, also adding capacity in the wind energy. There are also other countries like Malaysia, which is among the biggest producers of solar panels. So I think the fact that, well, there are different countries and they're becoming, leading markets in many different technologies or components for supply chains makes the whole region quite diversified. And I think this should, more or less be a recipe against some of, some severe geopolitical tensions in the region. I think it's important that countries stay competitive within the different regional cooperation frameworks like the ASEAN. So the more interaction between those countries, very helpful. Also, like between different regional blocks. So, I mean, everyone is interested in making the energy transition happening. So I think it's really important that countries collaborate their efforts, and maybe also that they see each other more or less, dependent on each other and more like friends and not competitors. So, of course, it would be helpful also maybe just to frame these issues of energy transition and supply chains as, somewhat being like a public good, something that is really needed for the whole region. And we see some of the efforts which are quite promising. And we also know that, well, there are some organizations, again, like IRENA, although IRENA itself, I think it still has a limited capacity to cover the entire world and be like the UN. But I think that, well, there must be more global efforts to, to streamline some of the regional processes when it comes to the, effective collaboration on renewable energy and energy transition, but also some global efforts so that those big blocks should kind of get together, and some successful regional associations can also get together. But at the same time, we also have, as I presented before, that we have this trend of friendshoring, of making the production of some of, for example, minerals and also new technologies purely domestic issues, and relying less on some of the remote global markets. So I think what we need we need more dialogue, more interaction on those issues, and understanding that this is in the common interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we do have one more question here, but I think part of it has already been addressed by by Cory and also Roman. But I do want to take a twist on the last part of the question, which I'm sure maybe Caroline can address a little bit more. So the question was asking about whether there are any existing multilateral mechanisms like the UN or has been helping achieving some of the in terms of mitigating the impacts on geopolitical tensions. But I also want to find out more about from the human rights perspective. Like, has there been any other multilateral bodies that that's been working on some of these issues? I think we sort of touched on that a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on some of these existing bodies or schemes or policies that are in place.
Thanks, Bonnie. Certainly, we see some UN agencies looking at this with greater attention. There is a UN working group on business and human rights, which has been looking very recently and very closely at exactly this issue of human rights in extraction of transition minerals and in extractive activities in general. And they are also for example, and that's because that's what I work on from a business and human rights perspective. We also have seen the OECD revising their guideline on responsible business conduct across for all sectors, and that is a fundamental instrument that large companies and businesses look at when they are looking for how to conduct their business in a responsible manner. And given the current challenges of the energy transition, the need to reconcile going fast, but also being fair and respecting human rights, which is fundamental responsibility of companies, the OECD have very recently revised their guidelines for multinational enterprises. And so this is going to be reflected probably in the type of cases that are being brought out to OECD national contact points. So that's outside of the UN, but yes, we certainly see a lot of this also happening, and a lot of reflections and discussions on how to recommend responsible business conduct policies and practices to address effectively the challenge of the energy transition.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we are a little bit overrun, but I'm glad that we had the opportunity today and the time to connect three speakers and also with our fellow audience to talk about a lot of these geopolitical risks concerning globally, from whether it's US, China, some of these bigger economies, to some of the secondary economies that are within Southeast Asia, about some of the issues and how do we navigate to succeed in energy transition. And so I just want to say a big thank you for our three panel speakers for their time today in taking part in such a valuable conversation. And I also hope our audience were able to benefit from some of the sharing that we have, and hopefully something to take home to think about. And I also hope that with this platform that we have today, that even between speakers and audiences, if you have other questions that you are curious about, feel free to reach out to them on their organization websites. And I hope that also this might be the start to more conversations, whether it's among our speakers as well. I heard from Cory that he's showing interest to stay in touch with some of our speakers. So hopefully, that can generate more constructive conversations and also, more developments within the sector and finding out ways to navigate the issues. Okay, so lastly, I'm just going to close by saying that this conference is organized by the CarbonCare InnoLab, and it's funded by the Jockey Club Charities Trust. We have a couple more interesting panels lined up for tomorrow, so do stay tuned and do check out the official website, which is www.ccinolab.org/ASECCC. Thank you very much for your time, and until I'll see some of you guys tomorrow, hopefully. But until then, take care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.